Igor Fedek, head of Southeastern Europe section of the new Geopolitics Research Network. And the topic of today's conversation is the tensions in relationship between Serbia and the European Union. So recently, Belgrade relations with Brussels are experiencing hard times. And after the last report of the European Commission, which was released in late March, they have become colder. The rhetoric from Brussels toward Belgrade is becoming sharper. In Eastern, Belgrade constantly talks back and sometimes even go on the verbal offensive. Therefore, the European Union, which continues to make Serbia's European integration dependent on the normalization of relations with Kosovo and democratic reforms in the country, as well as the actions of the Serbian leadership, which instead of strengthening democracy is trying to strengthen its regime, do not bring the accession of Serbia to the European Union, but on the contrary, even more lead it into the dead end. About all the complexity of relations between Serbia and the European Union nowadays, and how this affects the country's European perspective, we will talk with Nikola Burazer, the program director at the Belgrade-based Center for Contemporary Politics and the Executive Director at European Western Balkans. Mr. Burazer, nice to meet you.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
So let's start with the question, how would you describe the current state of relations between Serbia and the European Union? And can we say that relations between them has reached that end?
Well, you could say that the Serbia's EU accession process was put to a halt somewhere 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, because Serbia hasn't opened a single negotiating chapter since December 2019. And there were opportunities last year to open more chapters, but it was basically the decision of the EU member states not to open any new chapters because of the concerns with the rule of law in Serbia. And generally, if you look at recent developments in Serbia in this past year or 2 years, you will see that the rhetoric coming from Brussels, from European Commission reports, from the European Parliament, etc., have been coming harsher and harsher on Serbia due to problems with the rule of law and state of democracy, etc. And especially after last year's parliamentary elections, which were considered to be unfair and have been boycotted by a large part of the opposition, there have been some very strong voices coming from the European Union, especially the European Parliament, to basically suspend EU accession negotiations with Serbia. And as a matter of fact, this is exactly what happened de facto due to Serbia not opening any new negotiating chapters last year. And we will see this year if the application of the new methodology will mean that Serbia will technically make some progress with opening some clusters, because now the chapters are being grouped into clusters, or we will actually see more standstill if opening of new clusters is to be conditioned maybe by the EU member states. So this year we will see whether there will be, let's say, some progress in this process. But certainly we can say that in the last year, there's been a standstill.
Standstill, but not a dead end.
Well, the process is ongoing. I mean, nobody ever said that the process was stopped. Nobody ever said from the European Union that Serbia does not have EU membership perspective. However, de facto, when you look at what happened in the past year, you will see that there's been a halt. Now, whether this halt is going to become a full stop, I guess depends a lot on what's going to happen this year, and whether Serbia is going to address all of these problems which have been mentioned by European institutions, and will there be some progress in establishing conditions for free and fair elections? Because this is currently maybe the biggest problem Serbia faces, as the political crisis, which started somewhere 2018, 2019, had basically escalated last year. And now Serbia basically has a one-party, or let's say almost one-party parliament, with no opposition into the parliament, which is something I would say quite special, something not really common for European countries, and certainly signals that something is very wrong with democracy in this country. So we will see this year if there is any kind of movement forward or not. But certainly there has been a full stop. But having a full stop is always a possibility, depending on how things go from here.
And to your opinion, what is the process of European integration for the current Serbian authorities? Is this the aim that will have the positive impact on the country's development, or just some kind of a means to achieve foreign and domestic policy goals?
Well, I believe that Serbia, just as all other countries here in the region, basically has no other option but to pursue EU accession, no matter how difficult the process might be, or no matter how long it appears to be. Just the fact that you are in the process of accession negotiations and that you have access to certain funds and that you have been provided some assistance from the European Union is beneficial for all the countries here in the region. Especially, of course, that EU membership itself would be very important for economic development of the region, political development, improving the conditions of the environment, etc., etc. So there are so many benefits to get from EU membership, but also from the very process of EU accession. But one of the reasons why Serbia pursues this membership goal, despite all the problems, is of course that there is support for EU membership in Serbia. Of course, it's not on the level as in other countries in the region. Serbia is the most, I would say, EU skeptical country of all the countries in the Western Balkans, and the support for EU accession has been diminishing in recent years. But still, there is, I would say, enough support among the citizens, so that basically any government who wants to remain in power and be unchallenged in power, as the current Serbian government is, has to at least theoretically pursue the goal of European integration.
Mm-hmm. And talking about the support of European integration of the country, so we can witness some kind of a paradoxical situation when on one hand the European integration is the state policy, but on the other hand the Serbian government officials and tabloids are openly trying to tarnish the European Union's image in the country. So how can this be?
Well, I would say that the more critical EU's reports on Serbia become, the harsher the rhetoric from Belgrade gets. So in the past years, we have seen that European Commission reports, for example, have been harsher and harsher on Serbia when it comes to rule of law, democratic institutions, etc. We have seen parliamentary groups in the European Parliament basically claiming that the Serbian elections are a mockery of democracy, etc., etc. So the rhetoric is becoming really, really harsh from that side. And as it is becoming clearer and clearer that Serbia is stuck in the EU accession process because of these problems, Belgrade is strengthening its own rhetoric against the European Union, basically deflecting the criticism that comes from Brussels or the member states. Of course, the goal is to portray the European Union and EU institutions as being somehow opposed to Serbian national interests, jealous of Serbian successes, and basically hypocritical and insincere when it comes to criticism coming to Serbia, whereas the Serbian government then, of course, is presented as fighting for Serbian national interests. And all of this criticism that comes from Brussels is therefore basically unfair, and it's a result of let's say bad intentions coming from Brussels. So that has I would say a very direct consequence on how the Serbian citizens observe the situation. Is it the fault of the EU or the fault of Serbia that the EU accession process is stuck? Of course, the government wants to show that the government is doing everything it can or it should, whereas Brussels is being unfair to Serbia. So that could be one of the reasons. Now, of course, the second reason, now this is maybe a bit more complicated, but this is something I sincerely believe. It is that the Serbian government has an interest in diminishing the support for EU accession in Serbia, because I would say the Serbian government has an interest in the long term to be basically the only actor or the only political force which is actually able to pursue European integration in Serbia, whereas the opposition is more to the right or more Eurosceptical, etc. This is not the reality of the moment. A large part of the opposition is in fact pro-European, probably much more pro-European than the government. But this entire campaign against the European Union, which is going on for years, and this rhetoric that being first launched by the government officials and then basically disseminated by pro-government media, has an effect that support for EU accession is diminishing, and that I would say nationalism is on the rise in Serbia. And in the long term, it will become harder and harder for any opposition party to basically to challenge the government on the basis of EU accession and a pro-EU approach. And as long as this is the case, the Serbian government would get the support it wants from the European Union and the EU member states, as it would be seen as the only relevant pro-European political force.
Mm-hmm. But don't you think that such a harsh rhetoric of Serbian government is some kind of playing with the fire? So, for example, the last words of President Vučić about the report, that he said that the parts of the report are the naked lies, and the members of the European Parliament, they are lost in time and space. So, are Serbian authorities, aren't they afraid that their behavior risks stopping any European Union aid program or even the negotiations?
Well, I would say that the Serbian government is testing the limits. And this is not the first time that there's been some rhetoric coming from Belgrade, which then raised quite a few eyebrows in the European Union and then prompted a reaction from EU officials, after which the rhetoric from Belgrade changed. I am mainly now referring to last year's case of this famous statement by President Vučić that EU solidarity is a fairy tale and that only China can help Serbia, and that China and Serbia have this steel friendship, etc., etc. Basically, most EU officials have reacted to this statement. There has been a lot of talk about, there's a lot of attention to this given in the European Union. And then later you saw in the Zagreb Declaration in May last year that the EU institutions have recognized the need to acknowledge EU aid and not use this kind of rhetoric. And interestingly, after that, the government approach changed a bit. Previously you had billboards around the city put by pro-government media, "Thank you, Brother C," so thanking the Chinese president for the assistance. And after this backlash from Brussels, you had billboards around the city coming from other pro-government media who were saying, "Thank you, EU." So, I would say this means testing the limits. And again, I would say that the Serbian government is testing the limits now with this harsh rhetoric. But then again, there is an interest of unlocking the accession negotiations, of opening new clusters this year. So now we have seen a bit of change in tone. We have now seen in the past couple of weeks positive statements about the European Union. We have seen President Vučić going to Brussels and explaining how this was a great visit, one of the best visits ever, because the EU will support building a railway line in Serbia, etc., etc. And therefore, you can again see that when maybe this kind of rhetoric coming from Belgrade, or not only the rhetoric but behavior of Serbian government really pushes to the limit and prompts a reaction from the EU institutions and harsh responses, then the Serbian government changes its approach a bit, trying to somehow improve the situation, or maybe change the minds of relevant institutions in the European Union. And this is exactly what we see again.
Yeah, but but we see, despite the harsh rhetoric coming from Belgrade, the European Union in general tolerates the behavior of the Serbian authorities. So, what is the reason for Brussels to tolerate all this harsh rhetoric coming from Belgrade and do not take on more drastic action against them?
Well, one explanation could surely be that Brussels, or let's say EU member states, do not see an alternative in Serbia. They don't see a strong opposition which could be an alternative to Vučić in short to medium term, and therefore have to accept that whatever they might do or not do, Vučić will be in power here in Serbia, and they will have to find a way to deal with him. So in that way, they're maybe more tolerant than they maybe should be. That could be one argument. Another argument, of course, could be, and it is in a way connected with the first one, it is that I would say the European Union, as well as the United States, are concerned about Russian and Chinese influence here in the region of the Western Balkans. And even though that they are pretty much aware of very strong connections and cooperation between Serbia on the one hand and Russia and China on the other, they might be concerned that by being harsher on Belgrade, by maybe closing down the doors to Belgrade completely,
push Russia Serbia to the Russian hands.
Exactly, would push Serbia harder towards Russia and China, etc. So maybe this is one part of the strategy, but this is also connected with the general idea that it is hard to imagine a regime change in the next couple of years in Serbia. So they are quite aware that the Vučić will remain here, and if he is pushed too much, he might turn more towards Russia and China. I'm not sure that this is exactly a good strategy by the European Union and the United States. I think it's devastating in the long term, and I would even argue that by being more tolerant to the Serbian government in the past several years, they have actually allowed this to happen, that Vučić is unchallenged, basically, and that he flirts more and more with China and Russia. But obviously, the approach of the Western powers remains more or less the same, and it is not likely it will change unless there is a political change on the horizon here in Serbia.
Maybe the last question about the elections, upcoming elections that will be held in Serbia next year, right? Will these elections have an impact on the Serbia-European Union relations?
Well, after the last phase of the inter-party dialogue was more or less observed as a failure, and after this standstill in the EU accession negotiations, which came more or less as a result of the political crisis and the elections that we had last year, which were not really considered to be free and fair, and of course boycotted by a large part of the opposition, it will be crucial now what happens in this new phase of the dialogue regarding, the continuation of the EU accession process. Both the European Commission and different EU officials, the European Parliament, they have all basically called on the Serbian government to engage with the opposition in this inter-party dialogue in order to improve electoral conditions. So basically, the EU recognizes the need for this dialogue to happen and for the electoral conditions to be improved so that there would actually be elections next year in which all opposition parties are going to take part in. Now, of course, if these conditions are not improved, we are likely to see a new boycott with unforeseen consequences, having in mind that we have not only parliamentary elections in line, because the parliamentary elections are not in line. We had the parliamentary elections last year, but the President Vučić has announced that there will be parliamentary elections next year as well, probably because of as some kind of recognition that the current parliament is basically not legitimate, as there was a very low turnout, there was basically absence of the opposition in the elections, and finally there is almost a complete absence of the opposition in the parliament. We only have some minority political parties now being basically the opposition in the parliament, which is quite irrelevant in the big picture. But also next year we expect to see presidential elections, regular presidential elections, and we expect very important city elections here in Belgrade, which are very important for the opposition, as it is generally seen as a quite realistic stepping stone to regime change in Serbia, having in mind that in Belgrade the polls are showing that the opposition has really good chances, and therefore it will be interesting to see what happens in this dialogue and whether there's going to be some agreement until the end of the year, and what kind of consequences will this have on all three elections next year.
Okay, thank you very much. This was Nikola Burazer from Belgrade. Thank you for your comment.